In April 2024, a gold pocket watch crossed an auction block in England and sold for nearly $1.5 million. The initials engraved on its case were 3 letters: J, J, A, simple, understated. The kind of monogram a man has pressed onto metal when he expects to live forever. He did not. That watch stopped ticking sometime in the early hours of April 15th, 1912, in the North Atlantic, roughly 400 miles south of Newfoundland. Its owner had just lifted his pregnant teenage wife through a lifeboat window with both hands. He asked the officer in charge if he might board with her. She was in a delicate condition, he said. Surely an exception could be made. The answer was no. John Jacob Astor IV was, by any honest measure, the wealthiest man aboard the most famous shipwreck in history. His fortune, estimated at $87 million, which approaches $3 billion today, was not merely large, it was architectural. It had shaped the skyline of Manhattan. His name was pressed into hotels, streets, libraries. His mother had spent 4 decades deciding, with cold precision, which families in America mattered and which ones did not. None of that bought him a seat in the lifeboat. This is not a story about the Titanic. The ship appears only at the end, the way death always does suddenly, after everything else has already happened. What came before was something richer and stranger. A dynasty assembled from nothing by a German immigrant with ambition and almost no English. A mother who turned social exclusion into an art form and wielded it like a weapon. A son who inherited everything except the desire to use it the way she intended. A man who would rather file a patent or write a science fiction novel than work a ballroom. There was a first marriage that curdled quietly across 2 continents. A scandalous divorce. A teenage bride whom respectable society refused to receive and respectable clergy refused to marry. The Astors were American royalty, the closest thing this country has ever produced to a ruling class that did not need to run for office. Their wealth was so vast, it felt structural, like weather. And yet in 1912, the heir to all of it stood on a tilting deck in the freezing dark, watched his wife's lifeboat lower toward the sea, and simply waited. No scene, no argument, no last-minute rescue. Just a man, a watch still ticking in his pocket, and the particular silence of someone who has accepted what is coming. That is where this story ends. But it begins somewhere very different in a small village outside Heidelberg, Germany, with a young man who had almost nothing and intended to change that. The first John Jacob Astor arrived in America with almost nothing, a few coins, some flutes to sell, and an appetite for accumulation that would eventually reshape New York City from the ground up. He was born Johann Jacob Astor in 1763 in the small village of Waldorf, just outside Heidelberg, Germany. His father was a butcher, respectable work, modest income, no particular future. Young Johann looked at that life and decided it wasn't his. At 16, he left for London to work with his brother in the musical instrument trade. It was a practical move, not a passionate one. He was already thinking further ahead than anyone around him realized. 4 years later, he boarded a ship for the newly independent United States. The crossing took months. Somewhere on that Atlantic passage, Astor fell into conversation with a fellow traveler who dealt in furs, specifically beaver pelts, which European fashion had made extraordinarily valuable. Hats required them. The market was hungry. The supply chain was disorganized and wide open. Astor listened. By the time he stepped off the ship in New York in 1784, the flute business was already behind him. He started at the bottom, apprenticing with a fur dealer, learning the trade from the inside, building relationships with trappers and Native American suppliers across upstate New York. Within a few years, he had his own shop. His wife Sarah ran the storefront while he pushed deeper into the wilderness to negotiate directly at the source. He understood something that most merchants in his position did not, that the real money was never in the middle. It was in controlling everything: the trappers, the trading posts, the agents, and eventually the ships that carried his goods to markets in Europe and China. He was not lucky, he was precise. When the Jay Treaty of 1794 opened British-controlled territory around the Great Lakes to American traders, Astor moved before the ink had dried. Within a decade, his American Fur Company dominated the industry from the Great Lakes to the Pacific Northwest. The city of Astoria, Oregon, which he founded in 1811 as a trading outpost at the mouth of the Columbia River, still carries his name. It was the first permanent American settlement on the Pacific coast. He had planted his flag on an entire continent. But Astor was never sentimental about any single enterprise. When beaver populations began declining in the 1830s and European fashion pivoted towards silk hats, he recognized the shift early and got out cleanly. He sold his fur interests and redirected everything into something that could not go out of style: land, specifically Manhattan. His brother Henry had urged him toward New York real estate as early as 1799, and Astor had listened then too. He began quietly acquiring parcels farmland in what is now Greenwich Village, blocks in Midtown, the Richmond Hill estate, which he purchased from Aaron Burr after Burr's finances collapsed in the aftermath of his duel with Alexander Hamilton. He bought whatever he could, wherever he could, at prices that reflected what Manhattan was rather than what it was about to become. His method was elegant in its patience. He rarely developed the land himself. Instead, he leased it typically on 2 one-year terms to tenants who built homes and businesses at their own expense. When the leases expired, everything on the property reverted to him. The buildings, the improvements, all of it. He simply waited while New York did the work for him. And New York obliged. Immigration surged. The population pushed relentlessly northward up the island. Land that had seemed remote became desirable, then indispensable. Astor's holdings multiplied in value while he collected rents and watched. By the 1840s, he was the wealthiest man in the United States, his fortune estimated at $20 million, representing roughly 1% of the entire American economy. No single individual had ever captured that proportion of national wealth before him. Adjusted for economic scale, the number dwarfs the fortunes of modern billionaires. When he died in March 1848, newspapers genuinely struggled to describe what he had left behind. He donated $400,000 to establish what eventually became the New York Public Library. He sent $50,000 back to Waldorf for a poorhouse and orphanage, a gesture toward the village he had outrun. The rest passed to his children, and through them to grandchildren, who tightened the family's grip on Manhattan with every passing decade. Their name went up on hotels, theaters, apartment buildings. They became landlords to tens of thousands of New Yorkers who would never once meet them. The Astors had arrived, but money, it turned out, was only the beginning. In the rigid social world of 19th century New York, wealth without pedigree was merely wealth. To claim the highest rung of American society, the family would need something money couldn't simply purchase. They would need a queen. And in 1853, William Backhouse Astor Jr. married a woman who had already decided she would be exactly that. Caroline Schermerhorn understood something that mere millionaires never quite grasped. Money could purchase mansions, jewels, carriages, and the finest table settings in New York. What it could not purchase was the thing that actually mattered, the right to decide who belonged. Caroline intended to hold that right herself, permanently. She was born in 1830 into one of New York's oldest Dutch families, and she arrived in the world already possessing what the Astors had spent 2 generations trying to acquire. The Schermerhorns traced their American roots directly to the original settlers of New Amsterdam. They were Knickerbocker aristocracy, the quiet, entrenched kind that never needed to announce itself because everyone already knew. They did not prove their standing. They inherited it, the way other people inherited furniture. When Caroline married William Backhouse Astor Jr. in 1853, the transaction was understood by both families for exactly what it was. The Astors brought the money. Caroline brought everything else: the bloodlines, the bearing, the social credibility that no amount of Manhattan real estate could manufacture. The original John Jacob had been a German immigrant who reportedly wiped his hands on the tablecloth at dinner parties. His descendants required polish. Caroline supplied it without being asked. The marriage itself was practical rather than passionate, which suited Caroline fine. William proved far more interested in horses, yachts, and extended absences than in the project of social dominance his wife was quietly assembling. He eventually owned the largest private yacht in America and spent months at sea each year, often in company his wife chose not to acknowledge publicly. Caroline responded with characteristic composure, remarking pleasantly that the sea air was so beneficial for dear William's health. If she could not govern her husband, she would govern everything around him. And she did. Through the 1860s and into the 1870s, Caroline built the machinery of social power with the patience and precision of an engineer. She cultivated the right families. She hosted dinners of exacting formality where every placement at the table communicated something. She dressed expensively but never frivolously, favoring dark silks and extraordinary diamonds that functioned less as adornment than as armor. Her portrait, painted by Carolus Duran, captures what everyone who met her already sensed: a woman of severe, unsmiling authority, no warmth, no vulnerability, only will. Her essential collaborator was Ward McAllister, a Georgia-born lawyer who had reinvented himself as New York society's foremost professional organizer. McAllister understood the mechanics of exclusivity with an almost scientific clarity. Together, he and Caroline constructed the concept that would define the Gilded Age in New York and echo far beyond it. The 400. The number supposedly derived from the capacity of Caroline's ballroom at her mansion on 5th Avenue and 34th Street, the idea being that only those 400 people truly constituted New York society. Whether the origin is historical fact or convenient mythology hardly matters. What mattered was the principle, and the principle was ruthless. By the 1880s, New York was flooding with new money. Railroad barons and industrial magnates were erecting palaces and demanding recognition. Caroline's answer was to draw a line and dare anyone to cross it. 400 people belonged. Everyone else, regardless of their millions, their houses, their ambitions, remained outside. The criteria were deliberately undefined, which made them impossible to argue against. Old family connections mattered, conduct mattered, knowing the right people mattered. But in the end, only Caroline's judgment was final. Her annual ball, held each January, became the most consequential social event in the country. An invitation confirmed your place among those who mattered. Exclusion was a verdict. Hostesses across the city arranged their entire social calendars in terror of scheduling something on the same evening, lest it suggest they hadn't expected to be included. The press stopped calling her Caroline Astor. They called her simply the Mrs. Astor. Other women shared the name by marriage. She held it by absolute authority. When her nephew William Waldorf Astor attempted to install his own wife as the rightful bearer of the title, arguing seniority by bloodline, Caroline ignored him so completely and so effectively that he eventually gave up, renounced his American citizenship, and relocated to England. She had defeated him without raising her voice once. She and William had 5 children, 4 daughters who married appropriately, and 1 son. Born in 1864 and named John Jacob Astor IV after his great-grandfather, the boy carried the full weight of the Astor legacy from his first breath. Caroline called him Jack. She dressed him beautifully, educated him expensively, and expected him to inherit her world without question. But Jack was nothing like his mother. Where she was controlled and commanding, he was internal and restless. Where she had mastered the performance of power, he preferred mechanical drawings and solitary thinking. The sole heir to America's most formidable social dynasty would grow into a man profoundly ill at ease in the very world she had built for him. That discomfort would define everything that followed. The newspapers didn't quite know what to do with him. Here was the only son of the most powerful social arbiter in America, heir to one of the largest private fortunes on the continent, and he seemed genuinely more interested in gears and pulleys than in ballrooms and dinner invitations. Some journalists took to calling him Jack Astor, twisting his name into a pun that was equal parts cruel and lazy. It stuck anyway, the way cruel things tend to. John Jacob Astor IV was born on July 13, 1864, at Ferncliff, the family's sprawling country estate in Rhinebeck, New York. He arrived as the 5th child and the only son, which meant his 4 older sisters had long since claimed whatever warmth their mother had available. What remained for Jack was something heavier: the Astor name, the Astor business, the Astor legacy. Every expectation the family had ever accumulated would eventually fall on him alone. His education followed the prescribed route without deviation. Street Paul's School in Concord, New Hampshire, then Harvard, He moved through both institutions without leaving much of a mark, a tall and somewhat ungainly young man who never quite acquired the easy social confidence that generational wealth was supposed to provide automatically. Classmates remembered him as quiet, occasionally odd, and far more absorbed in understanding how things worked than in cultivating the connections that would have pleased his mother enormously. Where Caroline mapped networks of influence, Jack sketched mechanical diagrams. Where she collected people, he collected ideas. The elaborate social machinery she had spent 4 decades assembling held no appeal for her son whatsoever. He wanted to build actual machines. In 1891, at 26, Jack married Ava Lowell Willing of Philadelphia, beautiful, socially polished, and thoroughly accomplished in all the ways Caroline valued most. Caroline approved. The match looked correct on paper. We will return to that marriage and its long, quiet deterioration. For now, what matters is that even a wife and a household could not settle the particular restlessness that lived inside Jack Astor. 3 years after the wedding, he published a novel. That alone would have raised eyebrows in certain drawing rooms. Astors managed property. They did not write science fiction. But the book itself was stranger and more interesting than anyone expected. A Journey in Other Worlds imagined the year 2000 inches, striking detail, spacecraft traveling between planets, a transformed Earth reshaped by technology, continents connected, climates altered by human industry. Critics found the prose serviceable and the philosophy somewhat muddled by spiritualism. But scattered throughout were predictions that would eventually seem less like fantasy and more like foresight. Airships crossing the Atlantic, screens projecting moving images, a planet gradually warming from the consequences of its own progress. Whether Jack possessed genuine visionary intelligence or simply a restless mind that couldn't stop projecting forward, the novel revealed something important. A man operating well outside the intellectual boundaries expected of Gilded Age aristocracy. The patterns followed. A bicycle brake in 1898, a pneumatic device for improving road surfaces, a vibratory disintegrator capable of producing gas from peat moss, contributions to the development of turbine engines. None of these inventions made him famous. None of them needed to. He had more money than any invention could generate. What he didn't have was purpose, and that absence hollowed him out in ways that wealth couldn't fill. The Spanish-American War provided something closer to it. When the conflict broke out in 1898, Jack did not respond the way men of his position typically responded, with a generous check and a patriotic speech at a comfortable distance. He personally financed and equipped an entire volunteer artillery battery, outfitting them with the finest material available, and arranged their deployment to the Philippines. Then he went further. He applied for a military commission himself. The Army appointed him Lieutenant Colonel in the United States Volunteers. He served on the staff of Major General William Shafter during the Santiago campaign in Cuba. He placed his yacht, the Nurmahal, at the disposal of the federal government. He even appeared in 2 documentary motion pictures covering the war effort. None of this was required of him. He could have watched the whole thing from Newport, as his class largely did. Instead, he chose heat, disease, and the genuine possibility of enemy fire. The man who fumbled through dinner parties performed with quiet competence under military structure. It turned out that discipline suited him considerably better than society ever had. When the war ended, the Army breveted him to the rank of colonel in recognition of his service. He preferred that title for the rest of his life, Colonel Astor, because it represented something he had actually earned rather than simply inherited. He returned to civilian life decorated and deeply unfulfilled. The hotels, the real estate, the family machinery, it all occupied his time without engaging anything essential in him. He continued to invent, to invest, to manage. He remained among the wealthiest men in America, and his marriage was quietly, irreversibly falling apart. The feud between the Astor cousins didn't play out in courtrooms or drawing rooms. It played out in brick and mortar, on the most expensive real estate in America, one demolished mansion at a time. William Waldorf Astor, Jack's older cousin, had nursed his resentment for years with the quiet intensity of a man who believes he has been denied something rightfully his. As the son of the eldest son, he considered himself the legitimate head of the American Astors. Caroline considered him a nephew who had overestimated his position. She had spent the better part of 4 decades establishing herself as the Mrs. Astor, and she had no intention of surrendering that title to anyone, least of all a relative who mistook seniority for authority. William Waldorf's response was architectural, and it was magnificent in its pettiness. In 1893, he demolished his father's mansion at 5th Avenue and 33rd Street and erected a massive luxury hotel directly on the site. He named it the Waldorf, after the German village where the dynasty had originated, a pointed reminder of shared roots that neither branch of the family particularly wanted to dwell on. The structure rose immediately beside Caroline's home, deliberately and without apology, casting shadows across her windows and flooding her street with the noise and traffic of commercial enterprise. It was a declaration of war dressed up as a business venture. Caroline refused to flinch. She simply packed up and moved uptown to a new mansion at 65th Street, leaving her old home behind with the composure of a woman who understood that retreating strategically is not the same as losing. William Waldorf had expected to provoke her. Instead, he had merely rearranged the furniture. Jack, watching all of this from the sidelines, saw something neither his mother nor his cousin had considered. He saw opportunity. In 1897, he demolished Caroline's former residence, the house he had grown up in, and constructed his own hotel directly adjoining his cousin's. He called it the Astoria. The two buildings were connected by an enclosed corridor that journalists quickly dubbed Peacock Alley, 300 feet of marble floors and mirrored walls where the fashionable and the ambitious paraded every afternoon, watching each other watch each other. The combined Waldorf Astoria became the largest and most celebrated hotel in New York almost immediately. 1,000 rooms, a ballroom capable of seating 1,500 guests. Its clientele included presidents, foreign dignitaries, European aristocrats, and anyone else with the means and the desire to be seen in the most prestigious address in the city. The cousins never reconciled personally. William Waldorf eventually renounced his American citizenship altogether, relocated to England, and purchased himself a title, becoming Viscount Astor, with the quiet desperation of a man who needed a country that would rank him properly. But their hotels remained physically joined, connected by that hyphenated corridor. The dash between Waldorf and Astoria represented a truce that neither man would have acknowledged out loud. Jack had proven he could match his cousin. Now he intended to surpass him entirely, and on his own terms. The St. Regis Hotel opened on September 4th, 1904, at 5th Avenue and 55th Street. Jack had spent $5 million on its construction and furnishings, a figure that startled even people accustomed to Astor expenditures. The name came from his niece Helen, who suggested the Adirondack Lake near the family's vacation properties, a detail that gave the hotel a personal quality its competitors couldn't manufacture. What Jack built at the St. Regis was not simply a hotel. It was an argument, a direct, engineered statement about what luxury should actually mean when stripped of pretension and rebuilt from first principles. Every decision reflected the same methodical intelligence he brought to his patents and inventions. Each guest room contained a telephone, still a genuine novelty in most Manhattan buildings. A centralized fire alarm system connected every floor. Central heating eliminated the soot and inconvenience of individual fireplaces. Mail chutes on every level allowed correspondence to be dispatched without summoning a bellman. Most remarkably, Jack designed and installed a primitive air cooling system at a time when modern air conditioning did not yet exist anywhere. Using fans, ice, and a network of ductwork threaded through the building, he created a mechanism that allowed guests to adjust the temperature of their own rooms. It worked. In 1904, that was nothing short of extraordinary. He specified French marble throughout the corridors and staircases, having concluded that Italian marble had become too commonplace for a hotel of this ambition. A central vacuum system allowed housekeeping staff to plug cleaning hoses directly into wall sockets rather than hauling equipment from floor to floor. Every convenience he could engineer, he engineered. The St. Regis attracted precisely the clientele Jack had envisioned: families who took up residence for entire seasons. International visitors who expected European standards delivered with American efficiency, guests who valued genuine innovation as much as they valued elegance. Salvador Dali would eventually live there for years. Marlene Dietrich kept rooms. Broadcasting executive William Paley made it a second home. The King Coal Bar, anchored by Maxfield Parrish's luminous mural, became the kind of room where opinion and policy were shaped over unhurried afternoons. In 1906, Jack added one more property, the Knickerbocker, at Broadway and 42nd Street, built specifically to serve the theater district. The tenor, Enrico Caruso, maintained a permanent suite there and reportedly lined its walls with his personal collection of signed photographs. The hotel became a natural gathering place for actors, impresarios, and everyone orbiting the world of New York theater. 3 major hotels in less than a decade, each profitable, each bearing the unmistakable Astor imprint, practical innovation, dressed in understated elegance, function elevated until it became indistinguishable from art. His mother had commanded the drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue. Jack had built the rooms themselves. But hotels, it turned out, could not hold his attention indefinitely. By the time the Knickerbocker opened, his marriage had come apart completely. Ava had been living in Europe for years, moving through London society with the ease of a woman who had found her natural habitat. Newspapers speculated about affairs, about incompatibility, about the precise nature of a union that had ceased functioning long before anyone made it official. The couple had sustained separate lives across separate continents for so long that when Ava finally returned to New York in 1909 and filed for divorce, the legal proceedings felt less like a rupture than a formality. The scandal would have dismantled a lesser family entirely. For the Astors, it was merely the beginning. Their incompatibility was not a secret that emerged slowly over years. It was visible from the beginning to everyone who cared to look, which in New York society meant everyone. Ava Lowell Willing arrived in the marriage with credentials that needed no explanation. She came from old Philadelphia money, the kind with colonial roots so deep they had essentially become structural part of the city's foundation rather than merely its decoration. Her ancestor, Thomas Willing, had served as president of the First Bank of the United States. The Willings possessed what the Astors had spent 2 generations and an incomprehensible fortune trying to manufacture. Genuine pedigree, the kind you couldn't buy, the kind that simply was. She was 22 when she married Jack in February of 1891. The wedding took place at her parents' mansion on South Broad Street in Philadelphia, in surroundings that made clear which family considered itself the more distinguished party to the arrangement. Ava was regarded as one of the great beauties of her generation, dark-haired, sharp-featured, with a commanding physical presence that made rooms reorganize themselves around her without any apparent effort on her part. She understood this about herself completely, and she used it the way a skilled attorney uses precedent, quietly, consistently, and to maximum effect. Jack was 26, wealthy beyond calculation, and so socially uncomfortable that he struggled to sustain basic conversation at gatherings his own money had paid for. The mismatch declared itself almost immediately. Where Jack retreated into solitary evenings and mechanical drawings, Ava moved toward attention and admiration the way most people move toward warmth. She possessed a wit that was genuinely sharp and a tongue that was sharper still, and she deployed both without particular concern for who might be injured in the process. Acquaintances would later recall, with the careful diplomacy of people who had witnessed something ugly, that Ava mocked her husband openly at social functions, calling him stupid in front of guests, dismissing his observations before he had finished making them. One observer noted that Jack trailed after her at parties, like a man who had wandered into the wrong house and couldn't find the door. He couldn't match her appetite for the social performance. He didn't particularly want to, and she never forgave him for it. She gave him 2 children, at least. Vincent arrived in November of 1891, 9 months after the wedding, with the punctuality of an obligation being discharged. A daughter, Ava Alice Muriel, followed more than a decade later, in July of 1902. The 11-year gap between children communicated something that no one in their social circle needed explained. The marriage existed in name and legal fact. In every other sense that mattered, it had been over for years. By 1896, Ava had effectively relocated to London. She acquired a townhouse on Grosvenor Square and a country estate near Regent's Park, and proceeded to establish herself in circles that suited her considerably better than New York had. She moved through English society with the ease of a woman who had finally found her natural register. Her companions eventually included King Edward VII, which tells you everything you need to know about the altitude she had reached. Rumors linked her romantically to Winthrop Rutherford, a New York bachelor of legendary good looks whose name had been attached to several prominent women before her. Neither Ava nor Rutherford chose to clarify the situation publicly. Jack remained in New York. He built hotels, he filed patents, he raised Vincent largely on his own, in the quiet, slightly baffled way of a man who had not expected single parenthood but was determined to manage it competently. The Atlantic Ocean between husband and wife suited both of them well enough that the arrangement might have continued indefinitely. It didn't. In November of 1909, Ava returned to America and filed for divorce in White Plains, New York. The stated legal grounds were abandonment, a charge that satisfied the court's requirements without capturing the full texture of what had actually dissolved between them. The proceedings drew intense press coverage despite sustained efforts by both parties to seal the court records. Journalists speculated freely about affairs on both sides of the Atlantic. Neither Jack nor Ava confirmed or denied anything. They shared, at minimum, the instinct for privacy that their upbringings had instilled. 4 months later, in March of 1910, the state of New York granted the final decree. The financial settlement became one of the more durable mysteries of the proceedings. Some reports placed Ava's compensation at $10 million. Contemporary newspaper accounts suggested she ultimately accepted annual alimony of approximately $50,000, a fraction of what she had initially demanded, and a fraction of what Jack could have paid without noticing. The precise figure was never confirmed by either party. Vincent, now 18, chose without hesitation to remain with his father. He would enter Harvard that fall. He had never been close to his mother and would grow considerably more distant from her in the years ahead, a distance Ava seemed to accept without visible distress. Young Ava Alice, only 7, traveled to England with her mother. Jack did not contest the arrangement. He emerged from the divorce, publicly embarrassed and privately relieved, 2 conditions that the very wealthy have always been reasonably skilled at managing simultaneously. At 45, he found himself alone in a way he hadn't been since his mid-20s. His mother had died the previous year, taking with her the last great organizing force of his social world. His son would soon leave for college. The Astor holdings, the hotels, the real estate, the investments spreading across Manhattan like root systems, all of it belonged to him, and he had no one to share any of it with. Ava, for her part, flourished. She remarried in 1919, taking as her husband Thomas Lister, the 4th Baron Ribblesdale, in a ceremony so private that her own servants reportedly had no idea it had taken place until it was done. The title she had always understood herself to deserve was finally, officially hers. Ribblesdale died 6 years later. She never married again. When Ava died in 1958 at 89, she left $25,000 to her son, Vincent, a sum so modest in the context of what she had once possessed that it functioned less as inheritance than as acknowledgement. The bulk of her estate went to her daughter's children, but all of that was decades away. In the spring of 1910, Jack Astor was a divorced man, approaching 50, possessed of more wealth than almost any living person on earth, and entirely, conspicuously, alone. He would not remain so for long. Madeline. She was 17 years old when she first encountered Colonel Astor. He was 46. The summer of 1910 brought both of them to Bar Harbor, Maine, where the prosperous retreated each August, with the reliable instinct of people who prefer their discomfort seasonal and their scenery curated. Jack Astor had been coming to Mount Desert Island for years. He kept a yacht in the harbor, knew most of the families who summered there, and moved through the social landscape of Bar Harbor with the particular ease of a man who has earned the right to be left largely alone. He was comfortable here in a way he rarely managed in New York, away from the drawing rooms and the dinner tables, where his mother's ghost still seemed to be taking attendance. Madeline Talmadge Force was newer to these circles. Her family had money, but not the kind that generated its own gravity. Her father, William, owned a prosperous shipping company. Her mother, Catherine, came from solid Brooklyn stock, respectable, established, not quite at the altitude the Astors occupied. The Forces belonged to the comfortable upper tier of New York life, the stratum that attends the right events without quite being the reason anyone comes. They were welcome everywhere that mattered and indispensable nowhere. Madeline had graduated from Miss Spencer's school in Manhattan that spring. She was tall and naturally graceful, with clear, open features and an ease of manner that drew people toward her without any visible effort on her part. Friends described her as unusually capable for her age. She rode horses with genuine skill, handled sailboats with the confidence of someone who had grown up near water, and spoke passable French acquired during childhood trips to Europe. By December, she would make her formal debut into New York society, the ceremonial threshold that marked a girl's official arrival into the world of eligible young women. She hadn't crossed it yet when Jack Astor found her. No one recorded the exact circumstances of their first meeting, the precise moment, the introduction, the first exchange of words. What the record preserves is what came after. Jack began inviting Madeline on automobile drives through the Maine countryside and afternoon cruises aboard his yacht. Both were innocent activities viewed individually. Together, repeated, they constituted a declaration. The press noticed almost immediately. They always noticed anything involving an Astor. By the following winter, the two were appearing together at dinners Jack hosted at the street. Regis his hotel, his table, his terms. The speculation that had been murmuring through New York society grew louder through the spring of 1911, until by April, it had become something that newspapers were no longer content to merely suggest. New York is interested in Miss Force, declared one headline, with the barely contained excitement of a publication that understood exactly what it was sitting on. Pretty girl may marry rich Mr. Astor, announced another, dispensing with subtlety entirely. The stories returned obsessively to the same arithmetic. A teenager and a man nearly 3 decades her senior, a fresh divorce, a debutante younger than his own son. The combination was irresistible to a press that had learned, covering the Astors for generations, that propriety and this family occupied an uneasy relationship at the best of times. Jack was not deterred. Neither, notably, was Madeline. On the 1st of August, 1911, her father, William Force, descended the steps of his office at 78 Front Street in Lower Manhattan to face a crowd of reporters who had been gathering all morning on the strength of rumors that had finally outgrown any reasonable attempt at containment. He confirmed what they had come to hear. His daughter and Colonel John Jacob Astor IV were engaged. No wedding date had been set. What followed was extraordinary, even by the standards of an era that treated the private lives of wealthy New Yorkers as public entertainment. Religious leaders across the country condemned the match with a fervor that suggested personal injury. Episcopal doctrine at the time prohibited the remarriage of divorced persons whose former spouses still lived, and Ava was very much alive in London, presumably indifferent. Catholic priests delivered denunciations from their pulpits. A Philadelphia minister delivered a sermon that one newspaper described, with admirable restraint, as combining sound canon law with considerable railing invective. The Cincinnati Enquirer characterized the romance as one of wicked lust, a phrase that tells you more about the Cincinnati Enquirer than it does about Jack and Madeline. Letters arrived at the Force family home containing threats against Madeline, specifically the particular cruelty reserved, in every era, for young women who are perceived to have gotten above themselves. The sustained pressure made her physically ill. The 400 those families who had once gathered obediently in Caroline Astor's ballroom to receive the blessing of her approval closed ranks with impressive speed. They gave Madeline what the press accurately described as the cold shoulder. At social functions where she appeared, women turned away mid-conversation. No one acknowledged her as a future Mrs. Astor. Some refused to believe she would ever legitimately hold the title, as though their collective disapproval might function as a kind of veto. Jack responded the way he always responded to problems that money could address. He reportedly purchased a $30,000 engagement ring, worth approaching $1 million today, and arranged a financial settlement reported at $5 million to be activated should anything happen to him. Before or after the wedding, he would construct a fortress of wealth around this girl, stone by stone, if that was what the situation required. But there were 2 things his fortune could not purchase. It could not buy the social acceptance of people who had decided, with the cold finality of the truly entitled, that Madeline Force did not belong among them. And it could not find them a single minister willing to perform the ceremony. The wedding no one would perform. They tried the Episcopalians first. It was the natural starting point. The Astors had worshipped in Episcopal churches for generations. It was practically a family tradition, as much a part of the dynasty's identity as the Manhattan real estate and the annual social calendar. Jack himself had been baptized and confirmed in the faith. The church was where Astors marked their passages, births, marriages, deaths. It was where they expected, as a matter of inherited right, to be received. The church doors closed in their faces. Episcopal doctrine in 1911 was unambiguous on the matter. Clergy could not solemnize the marriage of a divorced person whose former spouse remained alive. Ava was very much alive, thriving, in fact, in London society, where she had built exactly the life she had always wanted. The faith that had baptized Jack Astor would not remarry him. The irony was noted, if not openly discussed. They moved on. Presbyterian ministers were approached and declined. Methodist clergy considered and refused. Baptist and Lutheran pastors offered the same answer with varying degrees of apology. One by one, across denominations, the doors closed with the quiet, implacable certainty of institutions protecting themselves from controversy they had not invited. Some cited genuine religious conviction about the sanctity of the original vow. Others, more honestly, simply did not want what came with saying yes, the press attention, the editorial condemnations, the professional consequences that would follow any clergyman bold enough to stand between Jack Astor and Madeleine Force and pronounce them husband and wife. Weeks accumulated. The engagement had been announced in August, and September arrived with no ceremony scheduled and no minister secured. Newspapers tracked the search with the undisguised delight of publications that had stumbled onto a story that kept giving. The richest bachelor in America, a man who could build hotels from scratch and outfit military batteries from his personal accounts, could not find a single willing officiant. The comedic possibilities were not lost on anyone covering it. At one point, Jack reportedly made inquiries about a man named Edwin Straight, originally ordained as a Free Baptist minister, subsequently retired from the ministry and working as a carpenter. The press found this detail irresistible and milked it accordingly. They called him the clerical carpenter, invoking a comparison that was almost certainly intentional. Whatever arrangement Jack had been considering with Straight never materialized. The carpenter stayed a carpenter. Then, finally, a name emerged from the silence. Reverend Joseph Lambert, pastor of Elwood Temple Congregational Church in Providence, Rhode Island, was willing. The precise terms of his willingness were never fully established. Some accounts suggested that Jack offered Lambert approximately $2,000 for his services, a substantial sum in 1911, equivalent to well over $60,000 today. Lambert himself, when pressed by reporters, declined to discuss any financial arrangements with characteristic terseness, saying only that it was nobody's business. He was not wrong, but the refusal to deny it spoke its own language. The wedding took place on the morning of September 9th, 1911, at Beechwood Jack's Oceanside estate in Newport, Rhode Island. The setting was deliberate. Newport was distance. Newport was controlled. Newport meant they could stage the ceremony on their own terms, with their own guest list, without the social apparatus of New York surrounding it like a jury. The ceremony was held in the ballroom, the same room that had hosted countless elaborate gatherings during Caroline Astor's long reign over Newport society. Her American Beauty roses, her favorite flower, filled the space. There was something in that detail, whether intentional or simply coincidental, that felt like the house itself acknowledging what was happening within its walls. The mother's ballroom, now dressed for the son's second beginning. The gathering was small by any Astor standard. Madeleine's sister Catherine served as maid of honor. On Jack's side stood his son Vincent, 19 years old, performing the duties of best man with whatever private reservations a young man might reasonably hold about his father's choice of a stepmother barely older than himself. Vincent's expression that morning was not recorded. His thoughts remained his own. Lambert spoke, vows were exchanged, rings were placed. Within a matter of minutes, Madeleine Talmadge Force became Mrs. John Jacob Astor IV, a title that half of New York had spent months insisting she would never legitimately hold. There was no elaborate reception to follow, no orchestra, no receiving line of dignitaries. The newlyweds accepted congratulations from their small circle, posed for photographs, and moved toward the door. Jack's steam yacht Norma Hull was waiting in Newport Harbor. Within hours of the ceremony's conclusion, They were aboard and moving out to sea, leaving Newport behind them in the way people leave places where they have just done something the neighbors disapprove of. The minister did not fare nearly as well. Within weeks of officiating, Reverend Lambert found himself at the center of a professional storm he had perhaps not fully anticipated when he said yes. Fellow clergy criticized his decision in public forums and denominational publications. His congregation divided along lines that had nothing to do with theology and everything to do with the spectacle his participation had made him part of. In November, less than 2 months after he had joined the Astors together, Lambert resigned his position at Elwood Temple. He departed quietly and never publicly discussed whatever compensation, if any, Jack Astor had provided for the privilege of destroying his career. Back in New York, the social verdict was swift and unchanged. The women who had turned away from Madeline before the wedding showed no inclination to reconsider afterward. She remained, in their collective judgment, what she had always been, the young interloper who had captured a divorced man old enough to be her father and a minister desperate enough to make it legal. The ceremony had not transformed her into an acceptable Mrs. Astor. It had simply made the situation permanent. Jack understood the arithmetic precisely. The whispers would not stop. The exclusions would not soften. Every social event they attended in New York would carry the ambient threat of humiliation, the turned back, the conversation that ceased upon their arrival, the invitation that never came. There was only one reasonable response. Leave. Go somewhere. The Astor name carried history without baggage, where no one had an opinion about Madeline Force and no one remembered Caroline's guest lists. Egypt, Paris, anywhere that the weight of the dynasty couldn't follow them across the water. And when they finally decided to come home, they would do it in the manner befitting people who had nothing left to prove to anyone. They would book passage on the finest ship ever built. The Nourmahal carried them first to Rhinebeck, then south toward Bermuda, moving between the private properties and quiet harbors where the Astor name still functioned as a passport rather than a provocation. For a few weeks, the newlyweds existed in a kind of protected stillness. No ballrooms, no turned backs, no women performing the elaborate social theater of not seeing Madeline when she entered a room. But the eastern seaboard was too small and too connected to shelter them indefinitely. By November, the press had already reported that Colonel and Mrs. Astor intended to winter abroad. In January 1912, they boarded the Olympic, the largest ocean liner then in service, a sister ship to a vessel still under construction in Belfast, and crossed the Atlantic toward a continent that had no particular investment in the internal politics of New York society. Egypt received them without judgment. That alone was worth the crossing. The country offered everything America had refused them: distance, anonymity, and the particular perspective that only genuine antiquity can provide. They sailed up the Nile, they moved through Cairo, they stood before the pyramids at Giza and looked at something that had existed for 4,000 years before the Astor name meant anything at all. Whatever the 400 thought of Madeline Force, the Sphinx declined to weigh in. One American sought them out regardless. Margaret Brown was a Denver millionaire whose fortune had come from mining raw, extractive, unapologetically new. New York society had filed her under vulgar, too loud, too direct, too recently wealthy to be taken seriously in rooms where the right kind of money was old enough to have forgotten its origins. She had recently separated from her own husband and carried with her the specific knowledge of what it felt like to be assessed and found wanting by people whose primary qualification was that they had been born earlier. She and the Astors were natural companions. The three of them moved through Egypt together, an unlikely coalition of the excluded, bound less by affection than by the shared experience of being unwelcome in the same places. For the first time since the engagement announcement had detonated across the American press, Jack visibly relaxed. He pointed out engineering details embedded in ancient structures with the enthusiasm of a man who had been waiting years for a context in which that kind of observation was welcome. He sketched. He photographed. He examined mechanisms that had moved stone blocks weighing tons without the benefit of modern machinery, and he found in them something that the Street, Regis Hotel and the Waldorf Astoria had never quite provided: genuine admiration. Away from the social performance that New York demanded of him constantly, the awkward, internally displaced man Madeline had married seemed almost at ease in his own skin. Their Airedale Terrier Kitty traveled everywhere with them, Jack's companion of years. the one consistent presence in a life that had been otherwise defined by departure and dissolution. At one point during the Egyptian portion of the journey, Kitty disappeared. Jack searched with a focused urgency that suggested the dog's absence distressed him in ways he would never have applied to a social slight or a newspaper editorial. She was found. He was visibly relieved. Some losses, apparently, he was not prepared to absorb with equanimity. From Egypt, they moved to Paris, a city that has always understood how to receive wealthy Americans graciously and without inquiry. They stayed in the finest hotels, they dined in restaurants where the staff's only interest was the quality of the order. They attended the theater. For several months, they inhabited the version of their life that New York had made impossible. Simply two people, married, living well, unburdened by the accumulated weight of the Astor dynasty and its many opinions about itself. Then Madeleine discovered she was pregnant. The news reordered everything immediately. Jack was unambiguous. The child would be born on American soil, an American citizen, with an American birth certificate that left no room for questions about legitimacy or inheritance. The Astor Heir, or part heir, would arrive in New York. Planning began at once. Madeleine was 5 months along, tiring easily, and would require a private nurse for the crossing in addition to her personal maid. The accommodations would need to be exceptional. The passage itself would need to be the smoothest available. Jack made inquiries. A new ship was preparing for her maiden voyage, the Royal Mail steamer Titanic, departing Southampton on April 10th, 1912, bound for New York. The largest vessel ever constructed, even surpassing her sister, the Olympic. The newspapers called her unsinkable. Her first-class suites were said to be without rival on any ocean. Jack booked parlor cabins C62 through C64 on the starboard side. The best rooms on the best ship. Traveling with them would be his valet, Victor Robbins, Madeleine's maid, Rosalie Bidois, her nurse, Caroline Astor, and Kitty. On April 10th, the tender nomadic ferried them from Cherbourg Harbor out to the great ship anchored offshore. Madeleine boarded carefully, one hand through her husband's arm, the other managing the weight she now carried. The Titanic was everything its reputation had promised. The grand staircase descending in polished wood and wrought iron, electric lights burning throughout, their private promenade deck offering fresh Atlantic air without the social obligation of encountering other passengers. Jack moved through the ship with the alert appreciation of an engineer encountering something genuinely impressive. He pointed out construction details to anyone willing to listen. "She is unsinkable," he told fellow passengers, "a modern shipbuilding miracle." 4 days separated them from New York, 4 days from home, from whatever welcome or hostility awaited them there, from the world they had been running from since September. 4 days. The Titanic had departed Southampton on April 10th, carrying more than 2,200 souls, passengers and crew, distributed across 3 classes that might as well have been 3 different ships. So completely did they fail to intersect. She stopped at Cherbourg that evening to collect additional passengers from France, crossed to Queenstown on the southern Irish coast the following morning, and by noon on April 11th, the last visible land had dissolved behind her. Nothing ahead but open North Atlantic and the steady westward rhythm of a crossing that was supposed to take 5 days and deliver everyone safely home. For the Astors, those days passed in the particular quiet of people who have been running hard and finally stopped. The pregnancy had reduced Madeleine's stamina considerably. Extended walks exhausted her. She spent much of the crossing in their suite or on the enclosed private promenade deck adjoining their cabins, salt air, stillness, the sound of the ocean moving past the hull. Jack brought her books and sat beside her. Sometimes he read aloud. When her energy permitted, they moved through the ship's public spaces together, 2 people practicing the ordinary rhythms of married life in the most extraordinary floating structure ever built. And the Titanic was extraordinary. No ocean liner before her had offered anything comparable. Her gymnasium contained rowing machines, cycling apparatus, and mechanical horses designed to simulate the experience of riding a detail that would have appealed to Jack's engineering sensibility, even as it struck most passengers as faintly absurd. A swimming bath filled with heated seawater occupied one deck. Turkish baths built in the Moorish style offered steam rooms and cooling chambers. There was a library stocked with current novels, a barber shop, a dark room available to amateur photographers. The ship had been designed not merely as transportation, but as a destination, a self-contained world sufficiently equipped that arriving at the other end might almost feel like an interruption. Jack moved through it all with the alert appreciation of a man who understood what he was looking at. He examined fittings, questioned officers about the mechanisms governing the ship's operation, studied the engineering that kept 46,000 displaced tons moving through open water at 21 knots. The Titanic's reciprocating engines, combined with her central turbine, represented the furthest edge of what naval architecture had achieved in 1912. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, was aboard quietly moving through the vessel with a notebook, recording minor improvements to be incorporated into the sister ship still under construction, J. Bruce Ismay, managing director of the White Star Line, had also made the crossing, monitoring his company's most ambitious achievement with the proprietary attention of a man watching an investment perform. On the bridge, Captain Edward John Smith commanded with the settled authority of someone at the absolute end of a distinguished career. He was 62 years old, had served White Star for decades, and this was to be his final voyage before retirement. The company had assigned him their newest and largest ship as a farewell gesture, an honor that carried, in retrospect, a weight no one at the time could have recognized. First-class dinner on the evening of April 14th unfolded across 11 courses with the unhurried deliberateness of a ceremony. Oysters, consommé, poached salmon, filet mignon, roast duckling, lamb with mint sauce, a Roman punch to cleanse the palate, roast squab, cold asparagus, vinaigrette, pâté de foie gras, Waldorf pudding, French ice cream, cheese and fruit, coffee. Each course accompanied by appropriate wines. Dinner lasted hours. It was theater sustained by silver service, and everyone at the table understood their role in it. Captain Smith dined that evening with George Widener and his wife Eleanor Philadelphia Money, the respectable old kind who had brought their son Harry, a book collector returning from a buying trip in London. A steward who served the table later recalled that Smith laughed and talked easily with Jack Astor during the meal. Jack appeared content. The crossing had been smooth. The weather had cooperated generously. 3 more days separated them from New York, and whatever complicated reception awaited them there. After dinner, the men moved toward the smoking room. The ship's orchestra played near the grand staircase, and a few couples danced in the reception area below. The night outside was unusually, almost eerily calm, the sea lying flat as polished stone, without the gentle swells that typically accompanied mid-Atlantic crossings. Stars spread from horizon to horizon, unobstructed. It was, by any measure, a beautiful night. It was also dangerously cold, noticeably colder than the evenings before. Passengers who stepped onto the open decks remarked on it. Throughout the day, the Titanic had received wireless warnings from other vessels reporting icebergs drifting southward from the Arctic on the exact heading she was maintaining. Some of those messages reached the bridge. Some, apparently, did not reach the people who needed to act on them. The ship continued westward at nearly full speed. By 20 minutes before midnight, the first-class lounges had emptied. Madeline had retired early. Jack remained in their sitting room, reading. Kitty slept nearby. Outside, the temperature had dropped below freezing. In the crow's nest, Lookout Frederick Fleet strained into the darkness ahead without binoculars. They had been misplaced somewhere between Southampton and the open ocean. The sea was so perfectly still that no waves broke against obstacles to betray their presence. Nothing moved, nothing reflected, nothing warned. At 11:40 p.m., Fleet saw something massive and dark in the water directly ahead. He struck the warning bell 3 times and reached for the telephone to the bridge. Iceberg, right ahead. The impact woke some passengers and went entirely unnoticed by others. That alone tells you something about the scale of the ship, that 46,000 tons of steel could strike an iceberg and produce, in certain cabins, nothing more alarming than a faint shudder and the distant sound of glasses shifting on tabletops. Then silence. The kind that follows something that hasn't yet decided what it is. Jack had been in the sitting room when he felt it. He set down what he was doing and went to find out. The corridors were quiet in the way that precedes understanding rather than follows it. A handful of passengers had emerged from their staterooms, looking puzzled but not yet frightened. the facial expression of people whose minds are still constructing an innocent explanation. Someone mentioned ice scattered across the forward well deck. Jack kept moving toward the bridge. Captain Smith's expression, when Jack found him, communicated everything that Smith's words were still being careful not to say directly. Jack asked a practical question. His wife had retired early and was unwell. Did he need to wake her? Smith told him yes, they might need to take to the boats. That was enough. Jack returned to their suite and woke Madeline as quietly as he could, with the deliberate calm of a man who understands that the most useful thing he can offer in this moment is the appearance of control. He told her the ship had struck ice. He told her the damage did not appear serious. He told her they should dress warmly and put on their life belts as a precaution, emphasizing the word precaution, giving it weight it may not have deserved. Rosalie, Madeline's maid, and her nurse Caroline were summoned. While the women helped Madeline into warm clothing, Jack dressed himself, located additional life belts, and checked the fastenings on each one with the methodical attention he brought to every mechanical question. Then they made their way up to the boat deck. The scene above was disorienting in its contradictions. Officers moved with the focused efficiency of people who know precisely how bad things are. Around them, most passengers milled in confusion, still processing what was happening, still clinging to the reasonable assumption that nothing genuinely catastrophic could occur on a ship this size on a crossing this routine. Men stood in evening dress with life belts strapped awkwardly over their dinner jackets. Women had wrapped themselves in fur coats over nightgowns. Somewhere nearby, the ship's orchestra was playing, the music drifting across the deck with a surreal persistence that would later become one of the most discussed details of the entire night. The cold was immediate and absolute. Madeline shivered against it. Jack suggested the gymnasium enclosed, out of the wind, and just off the boat deck. The room was unlocked. They settled onto the mechanical riding apparatus, the same equipment that had seemed like an amusing novelty 3 days earlier, and sat together in their life belts, waiting while the ship continued its imperceptible tilt forward. Jack did not raise his voice. Witnesses who encountered him during these hours consistently noted the same quality, a stillness that read less like denial than like decision. At one point, he found a spare life belt and opened it with his penknife, peeling it apart to show Madeline what was inside cork, compressed and shaped, designed to keep a body at the surface regardless of what the body itself was doing. It was the gesture of an engineer and a husband simultaneously. Here is how this works. Here is what will keep you safe. Time passed. The bow's downward angle became impossible to ignore. Word arrived that Lifeboat 4 was being loaded from the enclosed promenade deck. One level below the windows could be opened to allow passengers to step directly into the boat as it hung from the davits. Jack guided Madeline down. Second Officer Lightoller had been struggling with the windows, which had been designed to open but had seized from cold or disuse. They finally gave way. The lifeboat swung just outside in the darkness, moving slightly as the ship continued to settle beneath them. Lightoller called for women and children. Rosalie went first, then Caroline. Then it was Madeline's turn. Jack helped lift her toward the opening. Her balance was compromised by the pregnancy, the weight distributed differently than her body had learned to expect. He steadied her from one side, while Colonel Archibald Gracie assisted from the other, and together they guided her through the window and into the hands waiting on the other side. Once Madeline was seated in the boat, Jack leaned through the window and spoke to Lightoller directly. His wife was in a delicate condition, he explained. Surely under the circumstances an exception could be made. Lightoller refused. No men until all women and children were loaded. Those were the orders, and he intended to keep them. Jack did not argue. He did not invoke his name or his fortune or the particular leverage that the wealthiest man aboard might reasonably have attempted in that moment. He nodded. He leaned through the window one more time and kissed Madeline goodbye. He told her not to worry. He would find another boat. They would meet in New York. Then he stepped back from the window and stood upright on the tilting deck and watched the lifeboat begin its long descent toward the black water below. It was just before 2 a.m. The Titanic's bow had dropped so far that the Atlantic was already washing across the forward deck in slow, dark sheets. The stern had lifted clear of the water, the propellers exposed to the freezing air. Jack walked back toward the boat deck. He was last seen near the starboard rail, standing with John Thayer, Harry Widener, and Arthur Ryerson, men who had dined together just hours earlier in a room full of silver and candlelight. Some accounts say he lit a cigarette. Others say he moved toward the collapsible boats that crew members were desperately trying to free from the roof of the officers' quarters. At 5 minutes to 2, Lifeboat 4 reached the surface of the water. Madeline looked back at the ship. She searched the figures still visible on the deck above, moving through the diminishing light for the shape of her husband. She could not find him. 25 minutes after, the last lifeboat pulled away from the Titanic's side, the ship was gone. The stern rose slowly, then faster, until the hull stood nearly vertical against a sky full of stars that offered no warmth and no witness worth anything. The lights flickered once and went permanently dark. A sound crossed the water that survivors would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe accurately, somewhere between thunder and the groan of something fundamental, giving way as everything unsecured inside the ship broke loose simultaneously. The hull split at the surface. The forward section tore free and dropped. The stern hung suspended for a moment that must have felt much longer to the people watching from the lifeboats, then followed. 20 minutes past 2, April 15th, 1912. More than 1,500 people entered the water. The temperature was below freezing. Without a boat, the human body had perhaps 15 minutes before it stopped cooperating entirely. Madeline survived. Her maid Rosalie survived. Her nurse Caroline survived. Jack did not. The Carpathia arrived at first light and began pulling the living from the lifeboats. By 9 in the morning, everyone who had made it through the night was aboard. The ship turned toward New York. Behind her, the North Atlantic resumed its indifference. A week later, the cable vessel Mackay Bennett reached the debris field. Her crew recovered hundreds of bodies, still floating in their lifebelts, preserved by water cold enough to have functioned, in the cruelest possible sense, as a morgue. Jack was recovered on April 22nd. The recovery record designated him body number 124. Blue serge suit, brown boots, diamond cufflinks, $2,400 in American currency, and a gold pocket watch, still on his person, engraved with 3 initials that the entire world already knew. The watch had stopped at 3:20, a full hour, and 10 minutes after the ship itself went under. Most watches recovered from the debris field had stopped at 2:10, the moment of submersion. Jack's had kept running. What that hour cost him, and what it looked like, no record describes. Vincent traveled to Halifax to identify and claim his father's remains. He was 20 years old. He was also, as of that morning, one of the wealthiest men in America. The funeral was held on May 4th at the Church of the Messiah in Rhinebeck, where Jack had served as church warden for 16 years. Madeline attended in deep mourning. So did Vincent. So did Jack's daughter Ava Alice. The first Mrs. Astor did not come. A private train carried the casket south along the Hudson to Manhattan, where Jack was laid to rest at Trinity Church Cemetery beside his mother Caroline, who had governed American society for 4 decades, now sharing her ground permanently with the son whose choices had scandalized it. The newspapers performed their customary transformation. The same publications that had condemned his marriage as an act of moral recklessness now praised his composure, his selflessness, his courage in stepping back from that window. The same voices that had called his love for Madeline scandalous now called his death heroic. It is always easier to admire the dead than to forgive the living for refusing to follow the rules. The will had been signed shortly after the wedding. Jack had understood, with the clear-eyed pragmatism of a man who had watched his mother weaponize social judgment for 4 decades, exactly what the world would say about his young bride once he was no longer there to shield her from it. He had tried, in the way that wealthy men try, to construct a financial fortress around her. What he built instead was a cage with very comfortable furnishings. The estate was valued at approximately $85 million. Its distribution was neither simple nor, in at least one critical respect, kind. Vincent, the only son from the first marriage, 20 years old, still raw from the crossing to Halifax to claim his father's body, received the bulk of it, $69 million. The yacht Nurmahal, the Ferncliff estate in Rhinebeck, the hotels, the business interests, the real estate holdings, threaded across Manhattan like a second skeleton beneath the city's streets. In a single morning, a young man who had watched his father kiss his stepmother goodbye through a lifeboat window became one of the wealthiest individuals in America. Ava Alice, Jack's daughter from the first marriage, received a $10 million trust fund. She was 10 years old and living in England with her mother, largely unaware of the architecture of grief being constructed around her inheritance. For the unborn child, the one Madeline was carrying when the Titanic went down, the reason they were on the ship at all, Jack had included a $3 million trust to be released upon the child's coming of age. It was the provision of a man who had thought carefully about futures he might not inhabit. Madeline's portion was the most elaborate and the most conditional. She received $100,000 outright, a sum that sounds generous until you measure it against the scale of everything else. She received the income from a $5 million trust fund. She received the use of the house at 840 Fifth Avenue, fully furnished. She received Beechwood, the Newport estate where they had married, fully furnished. She received her choice of automobile from Jack's personal collection and 5 of his horses. All of it came attached to a single sentence that negated everything else. If she remarried, she lost it. All of it except the initial $100,000. The trust income ceased. The Fifth Avenue house reverted to Vincent. Beechwood reverted to Vincent. The automobiles and horses disappeared back into the estate. Jack had written the clause with the specific intention of ensuring that his widow would remain, in perpetuity, identifiably his. The Astor name, it seemed, demanded fidelity even from beyond the North Atlantic. On August 14, 1912, 4 months after the sinking, in the Fifth Avenue house that belonged to her, only so long as she remained unclaimed by anyone else, Madeline gave birth to a son. She named him John Jacob Astor VI. They called him Jakey. He was the reason they had boarded the ship. He was, in the particular mathematics of inherited wealth, a $3 million clause that had learned to breathe. For 4 years, Madeline lived inside the terms Jack had constructed for her. She raised Jakey. She managed the households. She maintained the widow's posture that the will required. She was 23 years old, with the remainder of her life stretching ahead of her, and she was being paid, in the currency of trust, income, and furnished houses, to remain frozen at the moment of her husband's death. In 1916, she chose otherwise. William Dick had known her since childhood. Brooklyn family, respectable background, entirely unremarkable fortune by Astor standards. He loved her without conditions attached. He asked her to marry him. She said yes. The newspapers calculated the cost of her decision with the cheerful precision of people spending someone else's money. The trust income, the houses, the automobiles, the horses, approximately $3.5 million surrendered in a single choice. She walked away from it without apparent hesitation. Vincent watched his stepmother relinquish the provisions that had tethered her to the family name, then quietly reclaimed the Fifth Avenue house in Beechwood, along with whatever contempt he had been maintaining for the woman his father had loved and died beside. Madeline's marriage to Dick lasted 17 years before ending in divorce. She married once more after that, an Italian sportsman named Enzo Fiamonte, and that marriage ended too. When she died in 1940 at 46, she was buried at Trinity Church Cemetery in a plot carefully separated from the Astor ground. Jakey inherited what modest remnants she had retained. From his half-brother Vincent, who died childless in 1959, he inherited nothing at all. The clause had done precisely what it was designed to do. It had forced Madeline to choose between security and freedom, between the Astor name and her own life. She had chosen her own life twice, as it happened, with results that were neither triumphant nor tragic, but simply, honestly, human. Whether that made her foolish or brave has always depended entirely on who is doing the telling. When Jack's effects arrived in New York, Vincent claimed them personally. The cash $2,400 in American currency, still folded in a waterlogged wallet, the diamond cufflinks, the gold pencil, and the watch, a 1/4-carat Waltham, his father's initials engraved on the case in the clean, undemonstrative script of a man who never needed to announce himself. The movement had stopped somewhere in the North Atlantic, frozen at 3:20 by water cold enough to end a man, and precise enough, apparently, to mark the exact moment it did. Vincent had the mechanism restored by a watchmaker, the hand set moving again, the gears persuaded back into their original purpose. Then he put it in his own pocket and wore it for the next 2 decades. There is something worth sitting with in that detail. Vincent Astor was not a sentimental man by any available account. He took control of the family holdings at 20, managed the hotels and the real estate and the investments with the competent, slightly joyless efficiency of someone discharging an obligation rather than pursuing a vocation. He married 3 times. He gave away significant portions of his inherited fortune to philanthropic causes, driven by a discomfort with wealth constructed on the backs of tenement dwellers who had no alternative landlord. He never reconciled with Madeline. He never acknowledged Jakey as anything resembling family, and yet he wore his father's watch. Every day, for more than 20 years, he carried the one object that had survived the same night Jack had not. In 1935, Vincent stood as godfather at the christening of the infant son of William Dobbin, who had served as Jack's personal secretary. As a christening gift, he presented the child with his father's watch. The gesture resists simple interpretation. Perhaps he had carried it long enough and needed it to belong to someone else. Perhaps he wanted it held by a family that had loved Jack Astor without complication, without inheritance disputes or stepmother resentments, or the particular coldness that money and blood produce when combined incorrectly. Perhaps he simply understood that the watch had already told him everything it was going to. The Dobbin family kept it for 6 decades, through generations that had no personal memory of the man whose initials were pressed into the gold. In the late 1990s, they consigned it to auction. A private collector purchased it. For years afterward, the watch traveled between exhibitions and museum cases, displayed behind glass alongside other recovered artifacts, a relic elevated by catastrophe into something it was never designed to be. On April 27, 2024, it returned to the auction block. Henry Aldridge & Son, the Wiltshire firm that handles more Titanic material than anyone else on Earth, had estimated it might realize £150,000. Instead, an American collector paid just under $1.5 million, making it the most expensive piece of Titanic memorabilia ever sold, surpassing even the violin that bandleader Wallace Hartley had strapped to his body as the ship went down and played until there was no longer any point in playing. The buyer's name was not disclosed. The watch disappeared once more into private hands, which is where it began and perhaps where it belongs. It carried with it a story that started in a German village in 1763 with a butcher's son who looked at his father's life and decided it wasn't sufficient. 149 years later, that story ended in the North Atlantic at 20 minutes past 2 in the morning. Or perhaps it didn't end there exactly. Jack Astor was born into wealth he did not create, shaped by expectations he never entirely accepted, and died in circumstances that no amount of money or influence could alter by a single degree. He became, in death, a symbol of the Gilded Age, that era of unchecked fortune and unquestioned privilege that the Titanic herself seemed designed to embody and the iceberg seemed designed to answer. The unsinkable ship, the monument to human certainty, humbled in under 3 hours by a floating piece of Arctic ice. But symbols flatten people. Jack Astor was also a man who wrote science fiction novels that nobody quite knew what to do with, who patented inventions that mostly didn't change the world, who survived a wretched first marriage and then had the audacity to be genuinely happy in his second one, happy enough that respectable society never forgave him for it. He was a man who helped his pregnant wife through a lifeboat window, asked quietly if he might join her, accepted the refusal without a word of protest, and stepped back into the dark. The newspapers made him a hero. History made him a cautionary tale. Neither version is sufficient. What remains is a gold watch that kept time for a man who had none left. The hand stopped at 3:20 on the morning of April 15th, 1912, a full hour after the ship went under. An hour during which Jack Astor floated in water below freezing, the watch still ticking against his chest in the darkness, measuring out the last interval with the same indifferent precision it had always kept. Some things survive. Some things are lost in water so deep they will never be recovered. The difference, in the end, is simply a matter of what the sea decides to return.